This documentary contains disturbing material involving real crimes and victims. Viewer discretion is advised.
12.5 years ago, the bodies of 4 people were found over several days, buried near a remote beach on New York's Long Island. All 4 were women murdered, wrapped in burlap. They were eventually identified as Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Amber Lynn Costello, and they were not the only ones.
On May 1st, 2010, a 23-year-old woman called 911 from a small community on Long Island. She told the dispatcher someone was after her.
State Police, Trooper Fry. State Police.
Yeah, there's somebody after me.
I'm sorry?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Okay, where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you, ma'am?
I don't know.
You're driving right now?
No, I'm inside the house.
I'm sorry?
I'm inside the house.
She was running through the darkness, trying to find someone who could help her. She asked police if they could trace her phone.
What house?
I don't know. Can you trace where I am?
I'm sorry?
Can you trace where I am?
No, I can't. What's your callback number you're calling from?
Huh?
What phone number are you calling from?
Somebody's after me. Please.
Are you in Suffolk County or Nassau County?
I'm in Long Island.
Where on Long Island are you?
No. No.
Then she disappeared. 8 months later, police searching for her found a body. It wasn't Shannon. Then they found another, then another, then another. Oak Beach is not a place most people would associate with a murder investigation. It's a small community on Long Island's Barrier Island, surrounded by water, marshland, and narrow roads. On that night, Shannon had been working as an escort. She had gone to Oak Beach to meet a client. And sometime during the early morning hours, something went wrong. Shannon left the house where she had been staying. She was distressed enough to call 911. And according to the released recording, she believed somebody was following her. The call lasted roughly 20 minutes. During that time, Shannon spoke with the dispatcher while moving through the neighborhood. She said she was inside a house at one point. She said she didn't know where she was. And she repeatedly expressed fear, but the situation became even more confusing. Other people in the neighborhood were now becoming involved. One resident called 911 after seeing Shannon. Another reported hearing or seeing a woman running and screaming. There were now multiple witnesses, the 911 call, and a woman desperately trying to get away from whatever she believed was happening. And then the trail stopped. Shannon was gone. Police began searching for her. Friends and family wanted answers. And at first, the case looked like a missing person investigation. There was no body, no confirmed crime scene, no known killer, and no clear explanation for what had happened after that 911 call. But 8 months later, on December 11, 2010, Suffolk County Police were searching along Ocean Parkway. The search was connected to Shannon Gilbert. An officer conducting a training exercise with a police dog entered the brush. The dog alerted. The officer investigated and, there, he found human remains. Investigators initially had reason to believe they might have finally found Shannon, but the remains belonged to someone else. Her name was Melissa Barthelemy. Melissa was 24 years old. She had disappeared more than a year earlier, July 2009. And suddenly, Shannon Gilbert wasn't the only missing woman connected to this stretch of Long Island. Investigators continued searching, and what they found next changed the case completely. Another set of remains, then another. Within days, 4 women had been found: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes. 4 women who had disappeared separately. 4 victims found in the same general area, and investigators now had a question that was far more disturbing than the one they started with. Who had put them there? But there was something investigators still didn't know. The woman whose disappearance had started the search was still missing, and the 4 women they had just found were only the beginning. 8 months after Shannon Gilbert disappeared, investigators were still searching for her. Then, on December 11th, 2010, a Suffolk County police officer was conducting a training exercise with his K9 partner along Ocean Parkway. The dog's name was Blue, and during the search, Blue alerted his handler to something in the brush. It was human remains.
He's conducting a training exercise.
The dog gave me an indication, which means his tail started waving. He started sampling the air. At that point, I saw the skeletal remains of a body.
The remains were eventually identified as 24-year-old Melissa Barthelemy. At first, investigators had one body. One unidentified killer was possible. One missing woman was still unaccounted for. But then police searched the surrounding area. 2 days later, they found another set of remains. The remains were found along the same isolated stretch of Ocean Parkway, close enough together that investigators had to consider the possibility that they had been placed there by the same person. And Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer publicly acknowledged what investigators were beginning to confront.
I was in the police department, Suffolk County Police Department at that time. I was chief of patrol, and not involved in the investigative end of it, but in charge of all the patrol units. And when I knew it was a serial killer.
A serial killer might be responsible, but there was a problem. The search had been triggered by Shannon Gilbert, and none of these 4 women was Shannon Gilbert. So investigators were now facing 2 mysteries. Where was Shannon? And who had killed the 4 women found along Ocean Parkway? For the families of the 4 women, there was finally an answer to one terrible question. They knew their daughters, sisters, and mothers were dead, but they still didn't know who had killed them. And investigators didn't yet know whether the 4 murders were connected. Police expanded the search, and what they found next made the case even more complicated, because the remains weren't limited to those 4 women. Some victims had disappeared years earlier. Some had remains discovered in completely different locations, and some had been lying unidentified for years. In particular, 2 locations would become increasingly important: Gilgo Beach and Manorville. Manorville was roughly 45 miles east of Gilgo Beach, and in 2000, investigators discovered partial skeletal remains there belonging to Valerie Mack. 3 years later, another woman's partial remains were discovered in the same general area. Her name was Jessica Taylor. She had disappeared in 2003, and eventually, investigators would discover that additional remains belonging to both women had been found near Ocean Parkway. That detail would become extremely important, because now investigators weren't simply looking at bodies abandoned in one location. They were looking at victims whose remains appeared in different places. Part of one victim in Manorville, additional remains near Gilgo, part of another victim in Manorville, additional remains near Ocean Parkway. The geography was beginning to tell a story, and whatever had happened to these women, someone had gone to considerable lengths to keep parts of the story hidden. But investigators still didn't know how many victims they were dealing with. They didn't know whether one killer was responsible for all of them.
We have no idea whatsoever that we're dealing with a serial killer.
And they certainly didn't know the name of the person they were looking for. Then another discovery would connect the coastline to a victim who had disappeared even earlier. Her name was Karen Vergata, and her story would eventually stretch across decades, and across more than one burial site. By the time police found the 4 bodies on Ocean Parkway, the investigation already contained years of missing person reports. Women had disappeared at different times, in different places, And at first, there was no obvious reason to connect them. But when investigators began putting the timelines beside each other, a disturbing pattern started to emerge. The earliest killing that Rex Heuermann would eventually admit to happened long before the name Gilgo Beach became associated with a serial killer investigation. In November 1993, according to his later admission, he picked her up, strangled her, and left her remains near Fish Cove Road in Southampton. Hunters discovered her remains on November 20th. She had a 5-year-old son. For years, Sandra Castilla's murder existed as its own case. No Gilgo 4, no sprawling task force, no Rex Heuermann, just a missing woman and a family waiting for answers. 3 years later, another woman disappeared. Her name was Karen Vergata. She was 34 years old, and her remains would eventually become one of the most important pieces of the entire investigation. In April 1996, Heuermann admitted meeting Vergata and strangling her. He then dismembered her and moved her remains to different locations. Her severed legs were discovered on Blue Point Beach, but investigators wouldn't know who those remains belonged to for decades. Almost 15 years later, during the expanded Gilgo search, her skull was found near Ocean Parkway. For years, investigators knew her only as Then Came Valerie Mack. She was 24. In 2000, hunters discovered a black plastic bag in Manorville. Inside were human remains. The victim was not immediately identified. And more than a decade later, another discovery would connect the case to Ocean Parkway. Her skull, hands, and right foot were found near Gilgo Beach in 2011. 2 locations, 1 victim. And investigators still didn't know who had done it.
They found a 6th, a 7th, an 8th, and 9th. Still not Shannon.
Then, in 2003, another woman disappeared. Jessica Taylor was 20 years old. Her remains were discovered in Manorville. But investigators immediately noticed something disturbing. Her head and arms were missing, and her tattoo had been severely damaged. Years later, investigators would recover her skull.
Both victims had their hands and head cut off, and there were no signs of struggle on their bodies.
Hands and forearm near Ocean Parkway. Once again, the same geography appeared. Manorville, Gilgo, a victim whose remains had been separated, and a killer who appeared to understand exactly how difficult it would be to identify her. The later prosecution filing says investigators believe the mutilation and removal of Taylor's identifying features were intended, among other things, to hinder identification. Then came Maureen Brainerd Barnes. She was 25. She was a mother. And in July 2007, she disappeared after arranging an appointment through an online advertisement. Years later, investigators would establish that the man who arranged that meeting had used a burner phone. According to Heuermann's 2026 admission, he picked Maureen up on July 9, 2007. He strangled her, and then transported her remains to Ocean Parkway. Her remains would not be discovered until December 2010.
Constant bodies being found.
More human remains on Long Island.
Another body.
Remains found yesterday are human.
And parts of bodies.
9 sets of bones found so far.
They discovered something that appears to be a human skull.
Then came Melissa Barthelemy, July 2009. She was 24. Like Maureen, Melissa had advertised her services online, and according to the prosecution's account, Heuermann used a burner phone to arrange their meeting. He picked her up. She never came home. And after her disappearance, something happened that would make Melissa's case different from the others. Her phone kept moving, and someone began calling her family. Someone who knew Melissa was dead. Melissa's younger sister received calls from Melissa's phone. The caller was a man, and according to the prosecution's evidence, he spoke about Melissa's death in a way designed to torment the family. He knew details. He knew she was gone. And yet Melissa's body hadn't been found. The phone activity would later become an important piece of the investigation. Because the calls weren't random. They created a digital trail, And that trail would eventually lead investigators toward Manhattan, but the most disturbing part was still ahead. Less than a year later, Megan Waterman disappeared. She was 22. She had a young daughter. And once again, an online advertisement had brought her into contact with a stranger. According to Heuermann's later admission, he used a burner phone to arrange the meeting. He picked Megan up from the Holiday Inn in Haupauge and killed her. Her remains were eventually transported to Ocean Parkway. 6 months later, they were found. And then there was Amber Costello. She was 27. She lived in West Babylon. And her disappearance would provide investigators with one of the most important witnesses in the entire case. On September 1st, 2010, a man attempted to arrange an encounter with Amber. But something went wrong. The meeting was disrupted. The man didn't get what he wanted, but he tried again. The following night, he contacted Amber again using another phone, and this time, she went with him. Look at the timeline now. 8 women, different years, different locations, but increasingly the same pattern. And the women were not random names on a police spreadsheet. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, women with people waiting for them to come home. But there was a problem. In 2010, investigators didn't have this timeline. They didn't know that the man who would eventually confess to 8 murders had been killing for nearly 2 decades. They didn't know about the burner phones. They didn't know about the connections between Manorville and Gilgo. And they certainly didn't know his name. They were looking at fragments. 8 disappearances, multiple crime scenes, different years, and one increasingly disturbing question. How could someone do this for so long without being caught? By September 2010, Amber Costello was dead, but investigators didn't know who had killed her. What they did have was a witness, someone who had seen the man Amber was supposed to meet. And years later, that description would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Amber lived with other women in West Babylon. On the night before she disappeared, a man came looking for her. He had arranged to meet her, but something happened that interrupted the meeting. The man left, and the people around Amber had seen him. They remembered that he was unusually tall. That detail mattered, because when investigators began looking at the circumstances surrounding Amber's disappearance, they weren't working with absolutely nothing. They had a description of the man, and they had something else. A vehicle. A Chevrolet Avalanche. That vehicle would eventually become one of the most important physical clues in the investigation. Because the man who had come looking for Amber wasn't simply a stranger who vanished into the night. He had arrived in a specific vehicle, and someone had seen it. Investigators now had a potential suspect description. A vehicle, a missing woman, and a location where the woman had last been seen. But the investigation didn't end there. The next night, the man contacted Amber again. This time, the meeting went ahead. Amber left, and she never returned. When investigators later found her remains along Ocean Parkway, the witness description became even more important. The man who had been trying to meet Amber was no longer simply a suspicious stranger. He was potentially the last person known to have arranged to see her. Today, knowing what happened later, it's tempting to look backward and say the answer should have been obvious. It wasn't. In 2010, investigators didn't know the man was Rex Heuermann. They didn't know that the same man would eventually be connected to multiple victims. They didn't know what was sitting inside his home. They didn't know what was stored on his computers. And they didn't know that the Chevrolet Avalanche would eventually connect an old witness account to a new suspect. They had pieces, but the pieces didn't yet form a picture. Years passed. The case remained unsolved, and the vehicle disappeared into the background of the investigation. Except, it didn't actually disappear. The vehicle associated with the Amber Costello investigation would eventually become part of the evidence used to identify Rex Heuermann. And when investigators finally began looking at Heuermann, The old description suddenly looked very different. But the vehicle wasn't the only clue investigators had failed to fully understand. Melissa Barthelomy's phone had generated another trail. After Melissa disappeared, her phone was used to make calls to her family. Some of those calls came from an area of Manhattan, and eventually, investigators would learn that the man responsible for Melissa's murder had a connection to Manhattan. He lived there. He worked there. And his movements would eventually become part of the reconstruction of the case. The killer had tried to separate himself from the women. Burner phones, false identities, different meeting locations, vehicles, remote disposal sites. But every time he interacted with a victim, he created another piece of information. A phone record, a cell site location, a witness memory, a vehicle, a digital trace. And years later, investigators would begin putting those traces together. That's what makes the Amber Costello investigation so important. It wasn't that police had a photograph of Rex Heuermann and simply failed to recognize him. They didn't. They had something more frustrating. They had fragments of the man, his vehicle, his appearance, his behavior, his contact with Amber. But they didn't yet have the connection. And then the case began to change. Because while the investigation was struggling to connect the victims, the department itself was becoming divided. Different theories, different priorities, different investigators, and eventually, the investigation had bodies. It had witnesses. It had evidence. But it was about to enter a period that would cost the case years, breaking died. And at the center of that was the Suffolk County Police Department. By December 2010, Suffolk County had a problem that was impossible to ignore. 4 women had been found within the same stretch of Ocean Parkway, and the investigation was expanding. But the bodies didn't come with instructions. They didn't tell investigators whether one person was responsible. They didn't explain how long the killer had been operating. And they didn't explain why these women had been left here. Investigators had to build the case from fragments. And almost immediately, there were disagreements about what those fragments meant. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer publicly suggested that a serial killer could be responsible.
We have no idea whatsoever that we're dealing with a serial killer.
But the investigation was not operating with a single, universally accepted theory. Were all the remains connected? Was there one killer? Or were several unrelated cases being pulled together simply because the victims had been found in the same general area? That distinction mattered, because every theory determined where investigators looked next, what evidence they prioritized, and which victims they believed belonged to the same story. Police expanded the search. Additional remains were discovered. Some victims were connected to remains found years earlier in other parts of Long Island. Some victims remained unidentified, and the case became increasingly difficult to define when Bloch was last seen. The investigation wasn't simply about a single crime scene anymore. It was a network of locations, different victims, different years, different pieces of evidence, and investigators had to determine which pieces belonged together.
Monday morning, homicide responded back to the location where the body was found and located 3 more bodies. They weren't all clustered, but they were within a quarter of a mile of each other, which would indicate that they were dumped there by the same person or persons.
Then another question emerged. How much help should federal investigators have in the case? The FBI had expertise that could potentially be valuable in a case involving multiple jurisdictions, missing women, digital evidence, and possible serial murder. But relations between federal investigators and Suffolk County Police would later become a major point of controversy. And this is where the story needs to be precise. We know there was serious dysfunction inside Suffolk County law enforcement. We know there were later federal investigations into corruption at the highest levels, but there is no established evidence that those officials were deliberately protecting Rex Heuermann. What we can establish is that the department itself was entering a period of extraordinary turmoil. In 2012, James Burke became Suffolk County's chief of department. He would eventually oversee the Gilgo investigation. But Burke's tenure would become overshadowed by something completely separate from the murders: a federal civil rights investigation.
Former police chief James Burke has been arrested, accused of soliciting sex at a local park. This after the 58-year-old previously went to prison for beating a handcuffed man.
In December 2012, Burke assaulted a handcuffed suspect inside a Suffolk County police precinct. The suspect was Christopher Loeb. Federal investigators later determined that Burke and others had attempted to conceal the assault and obstruct the investigation into it, and that investigation would eventually reach the highest levels of Suffolk County's law enforcement establishment. The Department of Justice later said Burke pleaded guilty to a civil rights violation and conspiracy to obstruct justice and was sentenced to 46 months in prison.
Burke repeatedly met with members of the Suffolk County Police Department who had witnessed Burke's assault of Loeb to agree on ways to get their story straight.
Every time I asked for a lawyer, I got hit again, I got choked, I got punched, I got slapped, I got kicked.
Thomas Spoda was Suffolk County's district attorney. He had known Burke for decades. And according to federal prosecutors, Spoda and his chief of investigations, Christopher McPartland, helped Burke conceal the assault and obstruct the federal investigation. In 2019, a federal jury convicted Spoda and McPartland. 2 years later, both were sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The convictions were not for protecting a serial killer. They were for obstructing the federal investigation into Burke's assault. That distinction matters, because it is easy to take a documented corruption scandal and turn it into a theory that the evidence doesn't support. But something else is undeniable. During the years when the Gilgo investigation was struggling to find answers, the leadership of Suffolk County law enforcement was becoming consumed by a corruption scandal of its own. And that leaves us with an uncomfortable question, not, did the police secretly protect Rex Heuermann? We cannot establish that. But, did years of institutional conflict, competing theories, and strained relationships make an already difficult investigation harder? That question is much harder to dismiss, because while the department was dealing with its own problems, the killer was still free, women were still disappearing, and evidence was getting older. Phones were being discarded. Memories were fading, and witnesses were getting further away from the events they had witnessed. On July 10, 2009, the burner phone associated with Melissa's disappearance traveled from Massapequa Park toward Midtown Manhattan. Later that evening, Melissa's phone moved from Midtown toward the area where she had been last seen. Those movements would become significant years later, because investigators would eventually discover something else. Rex Heuermann lived and worked in Manhattan. Heuermann worked as an architect. He maintained an office in Midtown, and his professional life placed him directly inside the same geographic area appearing in the phone records. Years later, investigators would compare the old phone records with Heuermann's movements. And suddenly, information that had once looked like isolated phone activity began to form a pattern. Massapequa Park, Manhattan, Ocean Parkway, again and again. But there was another detail. Every attempt to hide his identity created another piece of evidence. At the time, investigators didn't have the technology or the complete picture to understand what those pieces meant, but the records were there, waiting.
We begin here at 4:30 with a possible connection between a string of murders near Atlantic City and the alleged Gilgo Beach serial killer.
Investigators in New York do confirm to Action News they are looking into possible ties to the murders of 4 women in Egg Harbor Township back in 2006.
Then more than a decade passed. Technology changed. Investigative techniques changed. And the case was reopened with a different approach. Investigators began looking backward. Not just at the bodies, not just at the crime scenes, but at the invisible evidence. Phones, computer records, cell site data, financial records, vehicles, and the people connected to them. For years, the central question had been, who killed these women? But now investigators could ask something more precise. Who was using the phones? Who bought them? Who activated them? Investigators would focus on a man who had been living in Massapequa Park for decades. A man whose name had never been publicly associated with the Gilgo Beach murders. Rex Heuermann. For more than a decade, that name meant nothing to the public in connection with Gilgo Beach. He wasn't a fugitive. He wasn't hiding in another state. And he wasn't living under a fake identity. He was living in Massapequa Park, and for most of the people around him, he was simply an architect. Heuermann was the founder of an architecture and consulting firm in New York. He worked in Manhattan. He dealt with clients. He attended meetings. And he had built a life that, on the surface, looked ordinary. He was married. He had children. He owned a house. And he had lived in the same general area for years. Nothing about that public image immediately suggested the man investigators were now beginning to investigate. The house would eventually become one of the most important crime scenes in the investigation. But in 2022, it was simply home. A large house. A garage. A basement. And property where investigators would eventually search for evidence. But before police ever searched that property, they needed to know whether the man living there was actually connected to the victims. Investigators went backward, to the witness descriptions, and they began comparing those old pieces of evidence with Rex Heuermann, his movements, his phones, his vehicles, his addresses, and his history. The investigation was no longer asking whether a random stranger could have committed these murders. It was asking whether all of these old pieces pointed to the same man. Then investigators returned to the Chevrolet Avalanche. The vehicle had been associated with the man Amber Costello was supposed to meet. And Heuermann owned a Chevrolet Avalanche. That alone wasn't enough. Thousands of people owned similar vehicles. A vehicle isn't a fingerprint. But investigators had something more not. They had a witness description. They had phone records. They had the victims. And they had a man whose life intersected with several of those pieces. Investigators began watching Heuermann. Quietly. They weren't announcing an arrest. They weren't confronting him. They were building a case. They followed him. They watched where he went. And they began collecting evidence without letting him know how much they already understood. Then investigators followed him to a place where they believed they could obtain something far more valuable than another phone record. Investigators needed his DNA. But they couldn't simply walk up and ask for a sample. So they watched. And eventually, Heuermann discarded food. A pizza crust. Investigators recovered it. And forensic testing was performed in Cardi. The DNA recovered from that discarded crust was compared with genetic material associated with the investigation, and the result was a major breakthrough. The DNA profile was consistent with a male profile found on evidence connected to one of the victims. Suddenly, investigators had something they hadn't had before. Not a theory, not a description, not a vehicle. Physical evidence. The old investigation had been built around fragments. Now those fragments were beginning to point toward one person, Rex Heuermann. And once investigators believed they had identified their suspect, the house in Massapequa Park looked very different. The garage looked different. The basement looked different. The vehicles looked different. Every object that had once appeared ordinary could now potentially contain evidence. Investigators didn't know exactly what they were going to find, but they were about to find out. On July 13, 2023, investigators moved. Police arrested Rex Heuermann, and they searched his home. The public had finally learned the name.
Something like this to happen right under our nose is pretty shocking.
Etienne de Villiers and his wife have lived next door to Rex Heuermann for nearly 3 decades, and he says he spoke with him almost daily.
The guy was odd and strange, but never violent.
But investigators were already looking beyond the man they had arrested. They were looking inside his life. And what they found there would turn the investigation from a cold case mystery into a forensic reconstruction. Police vehicles outside Heuermann's Massapequa Park home. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested. But the arrest was only the beginning, because investigators had spent months building a case around him. Now they had something they had never had before: access. They could search the house, the vehicles, the garage, the basement, and the electronic devices inside. Every object could potentially answer a question. When did he buy it? Who used it? Where had it been? And what did it contain? Search warrants followed, and eventually, investigators would seize more than 350 electronic devices. Among the material recovered from the basement was something that looked almost obsolete: a hard drive containing a backup from an old Palm Pilot. The device itself was no longer the important part. The data was. Investigators were able to recover a digital calendar, a date book, appointments, entries, information preserved from years earlier. Some of those dates would become extremely important. Investigators began comparing the calendar with the known dates surrounding the disappearances. Dates when victims vanished. Dates when phones were used. Dates when Heuermann had appointments or recorded activities. Then investigators began examining Heuermann's digital collection. And what they found was deeply disturbing. Court filings describe an extensive collection of violent, bondage, and torture pornography. Some of that material dated back decades. This distinction is important. Pornography, by itself, is not proof of murder. But investigators were not examining the material in isolation. They were comparing it with the physical evidence recovered from victims. One of the comparisons involved Valerie Mack. Investigators found evidence of searches and downloads involving bondage and violent sexual imagery around the period of her disappearance. In September 2000, investigators identified a significant increase in downloads involving BDSM material. And the prosecution later pointed to specific imagery involving women being restrained and breast mutilation. Those details were disturbing because investigators were comparing them with injuries and restraints documented in Valerie Mack's case.
Mack's other remains turned up on Ocean Parkway during the Gilgo Beach investigation. The FBI put Jane Doe's DNA into a public genealogy site, and investigators found Valerie Mack's aunt.
Then investigators discovered something else. Heuermann had been following the Gilgo investigation. In 2020, his home internet connection accessed a website created by Suffolk County Police to provide information about the Gilgo investigation. Not once, but on multiple occasions. And one of those visits was particularly striking. On May 23, 2020, his home IP address accessed the site, while it contained information about the unidentified Manorville victim who would soon be identified as Valerie Mack. 5 days later, she was identified. The investigators had entered the house looking for evidence. But the evidence wasn't one single object. And now investigators were asking a terrifying question. Was the house simply where Rex Heuermann lived? Or was it also where he planned? Because investigators were finding evidence that suggested planning, information about victims, and material that appeared to show an obsession with control and restraint. The investigation was moving beyond the question of who did it, and towards something much darker. How did he do it? And the answer was beginning to emerge from the evidence he had kept for years. Then investigators added another layer. Where were the victims found? Maureen's remains had been recovered near Gilgo. Other victims had connections to Manorville. Still others had remains found in multiple locations. The geography was beginning to look deliberate. A killer wasn't simply leaving bodies wherever convenient. The remains were being transported, separated, hidden, and sometimes moved long distances. Then investigators stepped back, and the pattern became clearer. The details changed. The victims changed. The years changed. But the underlying structure was remarkably similar.
April 11th of 2011, they found sets of remains that they believe belonged to 2 more people. So that was victims 9 and 10.
What you want to do now is to bring as many resources as possible, but do it in a coordinated way so that you don't muck up the good work of the Suffolk County Police, but at the same time bring further enhancements to their capability.
Now investigators placed Rex Heuermann into the same timeline, his alleged connection to burner phones, his workplace in Manhattan, his home, his Chevrolet Avalanche, and the DNA recovered from discarded food. The board was no longer empty, and now they had to answer the question that would determine the entire case. Was this evidence merely suspicious, or could investigators prove that Rex Heuermann had actually killed these women? The investigators weren't looking at 4 isolated murders anymore. They were reconstructing a method. Several of the women had advertised sexual services online. That gave the killer something he needed: access. He didn't have to stalk a stranger in a parking lot. He could contact women who were already advertising, arrange a meeting, give them a time, and give them a location. The communication could happen through disposable phones. The identity could be concealed. And once the meeting was arranged, the victim had every reason to believe she was meeting a client. The purpose was obvious. Don't give the victim your real number. Don't create a permanent connection. Don't make yourself easy to identify. But the technology worked both ways. Every call still created a record. Every tower connection created a location. And every device could potentially become evidence. The women would leave to meet someone they believed was a client. Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber. Each woman had her own life, her own family, her own reasons for taking the appointment. But the person waiting for them had a different purpose. He wanted control. And according to the evidence prosecutors developed, that control became physical. Investigators found evidence that the victims had been restrained: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello. 3 of the 4 were restrained using burlap and tape. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was restrained using belts. According to the evidence presented by prosecutors, and later admissions by Heuermann, the murders involved strangulation. That detail matters, because it means the killer had to remain physically close to the victim. There was no distance, no weapon separating him from what he was doing. Control required proximity. And the evidence indicates that this was repeated, not once, not twice, but across multiple victims. The murder wasn't the end of the process. The killer still had a body. And he had a problem. Where do you put it? Ocean Parkway provided something the killer needed: isolation, dense vegetation, limited visibility, and long stretches of road where someone could disappear from view. Manorville became one of the most important locations in the investigation. Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, 2 women whose remains were discovered there. And portions of both victims were later found near Ocean Parkway. That meant investigators weren't dealing with a single disposal site. They were dealing with a system. A primary location, a secondary location, and a killer willing to transport human remains between them. There was another reason to separate a victim's remains: identification. Valerie Mack had a tattoo connected to her son. Jessica Taylor had a distinctive tattoo, and investigators later alleged that parts of those tattoos had been removed or mutilated. Investigators eventually found another important piece of the puzzle: a document recovered from Heuermann's computer, the so-called HK planning document. It contained references to locations investigators interpreted as dump sites, and one of those locations was Mill Road, the same general area where Valerie Mack's remains had been discovered. The document had been created in 2000, the same year Valerie Mack disappeared, but perhaps the most disturbing discovery wasn't the existence of a method. It was the evidence that suggested the method had been documented, stored, revisited, and preserved. For investigators, this changed the question again. This wasn't simply, who was the killer? They were now asking, how many times had he done this? Before Gilgo Beach, Before the missing women, before the massive search, before investigators began connecting phones, vehicles, and DNA, there was another murder, November 1993. And the woman at the center of it was Sandra Castilla. Sandra was 28 years old. She was living on Long Island, and in November 1993, she disappeared. Her body was later discovered near Fish Cove Road in Southampton. At the time, there was no connection to Gilgo Beach, no sprawling serial killer investigation, no national attention, just a homicide investigation into a woman whose life had been violently cut short. But the years passed, and Sandra Castilla's killer remained unidentified. But some evidence doesn't disappear when a case goes cold. It waits. Decades later, investigators returned to the physical evidence from Sandra's murder. And modern forensic technology gave them something investigators in 1993 could not have obtained: a genetic profile. Male hair recovered from evidence associated with Sandra Castilla was tested. And according to the prosecution's later filing, the results pointed toward Rex Heuermann. And then there was another woman, Karen Vergata. She disappeared in 1996. Her remains would eventually be found in multiple locations. Part of her remains were discovered on Fire Island. Decades later, additional remains were found near Ocean Parkway. Imagine what that means for a family. Someone disappears. You don't know where she is. You don't know what happened. You don't even know whether the remains found years later belonged to her. And then the Gilgo investigation began pulling old cases into a new orbit.
Able to identify Fire Island Jane Doe as Karen Vergata, who was 34 years old at the time of her disappearance. And I believe we have a picture of Miss Vergata. And I think it's important that we remember and honor not only Miss Vergata, but all the victims on Gilgo Beach.
Investigators eventually identified the remains as Karen Vergata. And prosecutors later alleged that Heuermann was responsible for her murder as well. According to his later admission, he met Vergata in 1996. He killed her and moved her remains. This wasn't one terrible period in someone's life. It was decades. But there was something investigators still couldn't explain: the gaps. Years passed between some of the known murders. What happened during those years? Did he stop? Did he change his method? Were there victims investigators hadn't found? Or were these simply the cases they had managed to connect? That question became one of the most haunting parts of the investigation. Because the known victims were not necessarily the complete story. Look at the story now. It doesn't begin in 2010. It doesn't even begin in 2007. The evidence prosecutors later presented reaches back to 1993, and the pattern continues through the 1990s, the 2000s, and into 2010. Gilgo Beach wasn't necessarily the beginning. It was the discovery that exposed the pattern. That changes the question. Everything began with Shannon Gilbert. And although her death has generated years of speculation, there is no established evidence that Rex Heuermann killed Shannon Gilbert. Police had originally gone looking for Shannon, but what they found changed the investigation. Human remains, then more, and more. And nobody was prepared for how many victims could be lying within the same stretch of Long Island. One of the most haunting cases became known as Peaches. In 1997, a dismembered female torso was discovered inside a plastic container in Hempstead Lake State Park. She had been dismembered, and several portions of her remains were missing. A peach-shaped tattoo on her upper body. No confirmed killer, just a body, and a mystery. Then the case became even more disturbing. DNA testing later indicated that a toddler found on Gilgo Beach was believed to be the child of the unidentified woman known as Peaches. Another unidentified victim became known as Jane Doe No. 3. Her remains were discovered in the same broad investigation surrounding Ocean Parkway. But again, investigators couldn't simply assume she belonged to the same killer. Then there was a victim who complicated the picture even further. An unidentified Asian male. His skeletal remains were discovered near Ocean Parkway in April 2011. And unlike the women dominating the investigation, he was male. The FBI continues to list the victim as an unidentified homicide victim. His presence is another reminder that not every set of remains discovered around Gilgo can simply be assigned to one suspect. And this is where the investigation becomes complicated. On one side, 8 women whose murders Rex Heuermann ultimately admitted to. On the other side, victims whose deaths remain unresolved. It's tempting to look at all of these victims, put them on one timeline, and declare that one killer was responsible. But investigators have to do something harder. They have to prove the connection. Without that, a possibility remains a possibility. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part of Gilgo. The case didn't reveal one neat crime scene. It revealed a landscape. A place where victims had been hidden. A place where unidentified remains could remain undiscovered for years. A place where different murder investigations could overlap. And somewhere inside that maze, investigators were now trying to determine exactly where Rex Heuermann belonged. By the time Heuermann pleaded guilty in 2026, the picture was dramatically different from the one investigators had in 2010. He had admitted killing 8 women. By this point, investigators had built an enormous case around Rex Heuermann.
Have you discussed this case with your attorney?
Yes, I have.
Have you had enough time to discuss this case with your attorney?
Yes, I have.
After discussions with your lawyer, you feel it's in your best interest to plead guilty rather than go to trial?
Yes, Your Honor.
Are you satisfied with the manner in which your attorney's represented you in this case?
Yes, I am.
Investigators needed something biological, something that could place him closer to the victims. In 2022, investigators began secretly collecting discarded items from Rex Heuermann. They weren't looking for a confession. They were looking for DNA. One of the items came from a pizza box. Pizza crust. Something ordinary. Something most people would throw away without thinking. But investigators weren't thinking about dinner. They were thinking about genetics. The laboratory extracted DNA from the discarded material. And investigators compared it with genetic evidence already associated with the case. The result gave them something they could work with. The mitochondrial DNA profile from the pizza crust matched the mitochondrial DNA profile obtained from Heuermann's buccal swab. Testing of the material recovered from the pizza box produced a male nuclear DNA profile, and investigators compared that profile with Heuermann's own buccal swab. Investigators also tested bottles that had been collected from Heuermann during the investigation. The nuclear DNA recovered from those bottles was consistent with the same profile. Megan Waterman disappeared in June 2010. She was later found among the victims known as the Gilgo 4, and investigators recovered a male hair near the bottom of that burlap. The evidence began stacking. By the summer of 2023, the investigation had changed. Detectives were no longer asking whether Rex Heuermann should become a suspect. He already was. The question now was much more practical. How do you arrest a man investigators believed had been killing for decades, without giving him a chance to destroy evidence? For months, Rex Heuermann had no idea how closely investigators were watching him. They followed him to work. They watched him leave Manhattan. They observed him returning to Massapequa Park. They documented routines, vehicles, movements. They weren't looking for dramatic confrontations. They were looking for certainty. Every search warrant had to be justified. Every affidavit had to be supported. Investigators understood something. If they arrested the wrong man, years of work could collapse. So they kept checking. And checking again. By July 2023, there was nothing left to wait for. Rex Heuermann followed what appeared to be another ordinary day. He left home. He traveled toward Manhattan. He had no public indication that one of the largest serial murder investigations in New York history was about to end. But investigators were already in position. On the morning of July 13th, Rex Heuermann believed he was driving to work. He never made it. What he didn't know was that investigators had already decided This would be the last ordinary morning of his life. Nobody rushed. Nobody improvised. The operation had already been planned. Every detective knew exactly where they needed to be. By the time Rex Heuermann reached Midtown Manhattan, investigators were already waiting. They allowed him to follow his normal routine. He parked. He began walking. Then, investigators moved. Officers surrounded Rex Heuermann. They identified themselves and placed him under arrest. According to investigators, he offered little resistance. The man prosecutors believed had evaded investigators for years was now in custody. By now, the investigation was no longer dependent on one category of evidence. There wasn't one witness. There wasn't one DNA sample. There wasn't one phone record. There were hundreds of individual pieces, each supporting another. Digital evidence supporting physical evidence. Physical evidence supporting timelines. Timelines supporting phone records. And phone records supporting the movements investigators had reconstructed. For years, the families had wondered whether they would ever learn the truth. Would there be a trial? Would the evidence be tested before a jury? Or would the case end another way? In 2026, they finally had their answer. For nearly 13 years, the families had waited. They waited for arrests. They waited for answers. They waited for justice.
Today is really just a culmination of decades of mystery and pain.
But one question remained. Would Rex Heuermann fight the charges, or would he finally tell investigators what happened? Then, something changed. Instead of preparing for years of testimony, Rex Heuermann chose another path. 8 women, 8 murders, 8 families who had waited years to hear those words. Inside the courtroom, Heuermann admitted responsibility for the murders. There was no dramatic cross-examination, no months of jury testimony, no lengthy public trial. Instead,
there are no words I can say. I am responsible for what was said in this room today. The words I would say have no meaning, and I'm going to leave it there at this time.
Speak up.
the admissions themselves became one of the most significant moments in the entire investigation. For years, investigators had been assembling evidence. Now, the defendant acknowledged the killings. For many families, the guilty plea brought relief. But relief doesn't erase grief. It doesn't restore birthdays. It doesn't replace daughters. It doesn't return decades that were stolen. Justice can answer legal questions. It cannot undo loss.
You want to know what it is to play God? Well, you will have to face him.
I hope he's forced to sit with the reality to feel even a fraction of the weight, the trauma and the pain I've carried for so long. To our family is beyond what words can express.
The Gilgo investigation changed policing on Long Island. It led to the creation of a dedicated task force. It brought renewed attention to cold cases. It demonstrated how advances in forensic science could solve crimes decades later. The investigation also became a lesson in persistence. Some evidence waited years before technology finally revealed its value. Yet even after the guilty pleas, not every question disappeared. Investigators solved the murders Heuermann admitted. But Gilgo Beach remains larger than one criminal case. The Gilgo Beach murders were never simply about one killer. They exposed failures. They revealed how vulnerable victims can disappear without immediate attention. They challenged investigators to rethink old assumptions. And they reminded the public that every unidentified victim is someone's missing family member. Sandra Costilla, Karen Vergata, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Brainard Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello. For years, some were known only through missing person posters. Some were known only through forensic files. Today, they are remembered by name. Cases like this often become known by the name of the person responsible, but they shouldn't. This story belongs to the women whose lives were taken and to the families who never stopped searching. The investigation may have ended in a courtroom, but remembrance doesn't end there. Every solved case reminds us why investigators preserve evidence, why families continue searching, and why victims deserve to be remembered long after the headlines disappear. In memory of the victims and in recognition of the investigators, forensic specialists, journalists, and families whose persistence helped uncover the truth. OMI investigations end with an arrest. Others end with answers. The Gilgo Beach investigation gave us both. But for many families, justice arrived years too late.
She made mistakes, who doesn't? She didn't deserve this. Nobody deserves this.
With respect to count 7, murder in the second degree, it's the sentence of the court that you serve an indeterminate term of imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years and a maximum of your life. With respect to count 8, murder in the second degree, it's the sentence of the court that you serve an indeterminate term of imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years and a maximum of your life. With respect to count 9, murder in the second degree, it's the sentence of the court that you serve an indeterminate term of imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years and a maximum of your life. And finally, with respect to count 10, murder in the second degree, it's the sentence of the court that you serve an indeterminate term of imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years and a maximum of your life. All of those sentences to run consecutive with each other. Mr. Tierney, with respect to counts 4, 5, and 6,
We move to dismiss, Your Honor, in satisfaction of that sentence.
that application is granted. Other agencies to collect. Anything else, gentlemen?
Nothing from the people.
Mr. Brown?
Nothing further.
All right, get him out of here.
If documentaries like this matter to you, Black Dossier is dedicated to investigating the cases that history should never forget. Our next investigation follows another case where years passed before investigators uncovered the truth.